Hello. Now picture the scene. It's 16th century Italy, Catholic country, and you are a psychopathic narcissist. I mean, you're so in love with yourself, it's actually unhealthy. No. You want to ditch your wife. You want rid of her. Well, what is a boy to do? Catholic country, those lads aren't big fans of divorce. And surely there must be a quicker way to get rid. Welcome to the darkly self-absorbed world of Duke Ferrara. Welcome to that gem of Victorian poetry, Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. Now the poem is loosely based on a true story. There was a Duke of Ferrara, and Ferrara's in the northeast of Italy, and his young wife died in very mysterious circumstances. Now Ferrara was suspected of her murder, but of course there was no CSI Ferrara back in the day, so nobody could nail him. Plus this guy had power, he had influence, he had money. That probably buffered him from the legal consequences of his crime. Now, if you'd have said to a Victorian reader the word Italy, that would have conjured up some very fruity connotations or associations, because Italy, to the Victorians, would have been linked to moral laxity, a kind of loosening of morals. Yes, it was a Catholic country, but it would have been linked with decadent aristocrats and political murders, corruption in high places, kind of classy corruption really, and aristocratic murders. We're not talking about two drunken toe rags going at each other with broken bottles in a pub. We're talking about dukes and counts stealthily, cleverly plotting the assassinations of each other. And of course there was a family called the Borgia family, who were infamous at the time for poisoning their political rivals. Apparently their steak tartare was to die for. Now we'll bounce straight into an analysis of the title, My Last Duchess. And we'll lock in on that word, my, because my is a possessive pronoun. And it's suggesting the Duke's possessive nature and initially highlighting that theme of control, of ownership. And you better believe these are two overriding urges, control and ownership, that the Duke had towards his last Duchess. And then we've got the adjective last, which is the first of many hints or suggestions that this Duchess is no more. She's dead. Now in terms of poetic form, My Last Duchess is a dramatic monologue, which is basically where you've got a character, clearly not the poet, but a character telling a story. And what this doofus usually doesn't realise is that although they are telling a story, they don't realise that they are the story, that their narrative is revealing more about them than the people and the events that they're describing. Now, if you're a fan of dramatic monologues, and they're a great genre really, subgenre, call it what you will, Alan Bennett is a modern playwright who does some fantastic dramatic monologues, most notably Talking Heads, worth checking out. Anyway, Browning was originally a playwright. He wasn't very successful, but you can understand how he'd have an affinity for creating characters to communicate ideas. So we've got this dingus, the Duke of Ferrara, telling a listener about his ex-wife, his last Duchess, and he rolls out a roster of criticisms against her. But as I say, this is revealing more about him than it is about her. And one of the things he does at first is he name drops an artist called Fra Pandolf, a fictitious artist, but immediately we're aware that this Duke is desperately trying to convey his own high status. That's what name droppers do. It's supposed to kind of, by proxy, by reflection, show how great you are, because you know these famous people. Also, he goes on to describe his wife as that piece, which I think is very significant because it's highlighting the way the Duke objectifies women. There's an A-star term for you, objectifies them. He's deeming them to be like possessions, not people. And clearly, therefore, they are lower in status than himself. We talked before about the title alluding to the Duke's controlling, possessive nature. And he's talking about the portrait of his wife, and he says, "But none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you, but I." So in other words, the Duke regulates access to his wife, albeit a painting here. And that is something that, as the poem will go on to reveal, he found frustratingly difficult to do when she was alive. Now, as early as line 2, we get an allusion, a kind of subtle oblique reference to the Duchess being dead. He's talking about the portrait of her, and the Duke says, this is my Duchess, looking as if she were alive. Subtle nod there to the fact she's dead. You get another foreshadowing allusion to her death in lines 18 and 19, when he talks about, on the portrait, the fact that she's got a kind of faint half flush that dies along her throat, like a kind of red mark or welt. And that verb dies is very significant, isn't it? Because we can infer from that the Duchess was murdered. And that word throat perhaps suggests she's been strangled, or some chancer has slit a windpipe. A little bit earlier, the Duke talks about the spot of joy on the Duchess's cheek. This is about line 14, 15. And this really exasperates the Duke, these spots of joy on her cheek, because he's so arrogant, he cannot conceive of anything other than himself bringing pleasure to her life. The line is, "Oh, sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy to the Duchess's cheek." Now, like a lot of punters who are preoccupied or obsessed with their image and status and appearances, the Duke is a big fan of the euphemism. This is where you convey your meaning indirectly, so as to not be too rude. It's a kind of nice way of maintaining civility or politeness. So the Duke, if he saw me, probably wouldn't say Mr. Taylor is balding or Mr. Taylor is ugly. No. He'd probably say something like, Mr. Taylor is follically challenged, or Mr. Taylor is facially disadvantaged. He'd use euphemism to sanitise and soften the meaning of his words. And we see it here when he's talking about his wife. I don't know what the kids call it these days. They have lots of nasty misogynistic names for it. Slag, slut, sket. He's basically calling his wife an adulterous, cheating woman. But of course, he doesn't want to be too crude. He has his reputation, his status to think about. So he says, she had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad. And those dashes are interesting as well, because although he's a very smooth, polished individual, that's kind of breaking up and fragmenting his delivery, and it's revealing the Duke's anxiety or anger about that behaviour. And we see our friend the euphemism bob it up a little bit later in this poem, when the Duke says, she thanked men good. Now, he doesn't mean she thanked them by giving them a book token or a hearty handshake. It's, again, a euphemism to sanitise and convey the idea that she was sleeping around, she was seeing other men. We've said before, haven't we, that the dramatic monologue form is a great vehicle for revealing as much about the teller as the tale that they're telling. And it's interesting that the Duke criticises the Duchess in lines 25 to 30 for all these interests that she has. It turns out she likes sunsets and donkey rides and cherries that some blokes nicked for her. And the Duke, so shallow is he, because of course this is a dramatic monologue revealing a lot about him, so shallow is he that he is incensed that she can derive the same amount of pleasure from something that isn't him. Again, it just telegraphs his shrieking narcissism to the hilt. We, on the other hand, the reader, simply infer that this girl, this Duchess, just had a kind of healthy passion for life, was a vivacious lassie. On the other hand, we see the joyless husband resenting her for finding pleasure outside of him. And if you're going to lock in on just one line that beautifully telegraphs the Duke's sky-high levels of self-absorption, look no further than line 32. The Duke says he can't believe that she ranked my gift of a 100-year-old name with anybody's gift. Wow, again we're seeing the shocking arrogance of this man. He feels that his title, his identity even, outstrips anything and everyone in terms of importance. And he can barely conceive of his wife not sharing that passion. On line 42, we learn that the Duke refuses to communicate with his wife regarding what he sees as her breach of etiquette, her poor behaviour, as that could be seen as stooping, and I chose never to stoop. So he's basically saying that he's never going to compromise his dignity, never going to lower himself by suggesting that she change what she does. And therefore, this problem isn't going to go away. This problem isn't going to resolve itself. Now, I'm no relationships counsellor. God knows. But I do know if you can't communicate with your spouse, your partner, you've got real problems. And this problem is not going to resolve itself because the poor Duchess, that poor lassie, doesn't even realise there is a problem because it's never been brought to her attention. Easy to see then why the Duke prefers a portrait rather than a person as the significant other in his life. Easy to control, easy to contain, and with a minimum of communication required. So, with no desire to actually talk to his wife about his anxieties, the Duke takes matters into his own hands. And these two short sentences convey the very swift, brutal snuffing out of the Duchess's life. He says, around line 45, I think, "I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together." Bit like euphemism, these lines communicate their meaning very indirectly. Their meaning is ambiguous or unclear. And that line, "I gave commands and all smiles stopped," can be interpreted at least three ways. Firstly, it might suggest that "I gave commands, then all smiles stopped" might suggest that she's been sent to a convent or a nunnery, and that will modify her behaviour. It's unlikely, but it's an interpretation. A second interpretation, unlikely but possible, is that perhaps he did eventually climb down off his high horse to tell his wife to change her behaviour. In the Duke's word, perhaps he ultimately stooped. It's unlikely, it's an interpretation. The third interpretation, of course, is one that most people can get behind, and that is the idea that she has been murdered. He gave commands, he probably got somebody to kill her, because let's face it, the Duke is not the kind of man who would sully his fingers doing something as vulgar as homicide. No, he'd outsource that to some scumbag third party. But he gave commands to somebody and they killed her, thus all smiles stopped together. In fact, the very next line adds veracity, credence, support to the idea that she's been murdered, because it says she's looking as if alive. A subtle nod there to the fact that this woman is now dead. But the Duke is no fool. Yes, he's arrogant, he's self-absorbed, he's obnoxious, but he's no divvy, and he's not said anything that would secure a conviction in a court of law. He has intentionally kept his language very vague. There is no way that he can get punished legally. There is no way, as it stands, that the hangman can get his hands on Duke Ferrara. A quick pit stop here to say something about the structure of the poem. Now, My Last Duchess is written in rhyming couplets in a structure known as iambic pentameter, which sounds terrifying. Basically means that there's 10 beats or syllables to each line of the poem. Now, it's very telling, it's very significant that the Duke delivers his chilling near admission of murder, this veiled admission of killing his wife, in such a measured, level way. And it's very significant because it conveys very clearly the Duke's emotional coldness. You could even suggest, if you want to be all A-star about it, that this conveys the Duke's psychopathic nature or psychopathic coolness. Now, I'm not going to blind you with the science of it, but a psychopath is very emotionally detached, which means they can do horrific things. You know, a psychopath could jump out the bushes, beat me to death with a cricket bat, and then casually saunter home, play with his kids, feed the dog, and go to bed. You know, they're untroubled by feelings of guilt and anxiety, like normal people. And just to round off this A-star digression, if I was looking at this iambic pentameter in the exam, I would say that the writer Browning here juxtaposes, that means put side by side, he juxtaposes a regular poetic form, that iambic pentameter all the way through, with irregular behaviour. In other words, the Duke's homicidal tendencies. So I would talk about how Browning juxtaposes the fixed iambic pentameter of the poem with the irregular, erratic behaviour of the Duke, and this creates an unsettling effect on the reader. And because the Duke has eluded justice over the murder of his wife, he's never had to learn his lesson, and he's happy to go on subjugating and controlling women. In fact, he's sizing up his next conquest. Turns out in line 49 that the chap he's speaking to in this poem is a representative or an emissary of the Count, a wealthy nobleman, and it's the Count's daughter that the Duke fancies marrying next. It's very telling, line 53, he refers to her as an object. Well, what a great metaphor for conveying the fact that this man is going to go on treating women as possessions, as objects, as things to be belittled and dominated. So, final lines of the poem, with one last name drop. Presumably Claus of Innsbruck is a famous sculptor. The Duke shows his listener a bronze statue of Neptune taming a seahorse. And this image is very symbolic, it's very metaphorical, because it symbolises the way the Duke treats women. The Duke has always tried to curb or control what he sees as the wild ways of his wife. And it's no coincidence then that this image, this sculpture, juxtaposes or puts side by side the idea of the god of the sea, Neptune, with the Duke. That highlights the narrator's God complex, the arrogance we talked about before. This man thinks he's superior to everyone else. And in a sense, he has that God complex because he believes he has the right to determine who lives, who dies, based on how they measure up to his value system. Very close to the end now, folks, and there's some good news if you're tired of my adenoidal voice and you don't have to worry about the context of the poem in the exam. You can just check out now. God be with you. However, if you do have to look at the context of the poem, how the poem reflects the era it was written, how the poem reflects things going on in the writer's life, then I'm going to shut up and just let you read these paragraphs, which are invaluable in linking the text to the period it was written. And some final juicy nuggets of contextual information to wrap your heads around. Again, I'll shut up, you make with the ready. Conclusions. Pause here for a succinct summary of the linguistic and structural techniques that this poem has used. Another batch of conclusions. I've had to use 2 pages given the Godzilla size of this video. Read away if you wish. Here's a final 10-second flourish to help students who have to link My Last Duchess to other poems on the theme of love or relationships. Have a read if that's you. And there you have it, folks. My Last Duchess, a dark little poem about a nasty little man who will always choose murder over marriage guidance.